It begins with a tax system that is fair, simple, and built on the principle that work and wealth should play by the same rules. For too long, the rules have favored money made from money over money made from work. And that's why billionaires pay lower effective tax rates than their own employees. A new school of economists, people like Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Zucman, have shown that it doesn't have to be this way. Imagine a world where banks automatically share account information so fortunes can't quietly disappear into Swiss vaults or Caribbean shell companies. Where global corporations no longer shift profits to Ireland or Bermuda, but pay a minimum tax rate wherever they operate. Where a billionaire with a $200 million yacht contributes on the same straightforward terms as a nurse or a teacher. Hello, I'm Rutger Bregman. In my third BBC Reith lecture called The Conspiracy of Decency, I'm arguing that ordinary people working together can change the world and that utopia can become a reality. On the night of October the 1st, 1943, the Nazis planned a lightning raid to deport every Jew in the small nation of Denmark. They chose the eve of the Jewish New Year, confident that their victims would be at home celebrating. But when the soldiers came, the houses stood empty. Someone had tipped the Jewish community off. In secret, tens of thousands of ordinary fishermen and shopkeepers, doctors and priests had organized escape routes and ferried thousands across the sea to safety. In the end, almost 99% of Danish Jews survived the war. There's a book about this extraordinary episode called A Conspiracy of Decency. And that phrase has always stuck with me. When we hear the word conspiracy, we usually think of flat earthers, anti-vaxxers, or men in basements with tinfoil hats. We, the rational ones, roll our eyes and say, conspiracies don't exist. But as a historian, I'm well aware that conspiracies do exist. In fact, I'm quite obsessed with them. Not the paranoid fantasies of QAnon or 9/11 truthers, but the real conspiracies of small groups with big ideas. History is full of examples. A dozen apostles spreading Christianity across an empire, a debating club of Jacobins toppling the French monarchy, an obscure think tank engineering the rise of neoliberal capitalism. Which brings me to where we are in these lectures. I promise to structure them like a classic three-part sermon. Act 1 is misery, Act 2 is redemption, and Act 3 is thankfulness. In my church-going experience, the third act of a sermon is usually the sleepiest part. But let's see if we can break that tradition. Because thankfulness, in my view, is not passive. It's not sitting back with folded hands. Gratitude means responsibility. To be thankful for the abolitionists is to keep building a freer world. To be thankful for the suffragettes is to protect and expand democracy. And to be thankful for those Danish citizens is to stand up for strangers when the knock comes at your door. Their conspiracies of decency are not just stories to admire. They are unfinished projects that we inherit. Thomas Clarkson, the abolitionist I spoke about last week in Liverpool, once wrote a 3-volume history of the Quakers, the radical Protestant sect that played a leading role in the fight against slavery. One of their distinctive practices was to bury the dead in unmarked graves. They believed you don't honor people with costly headstones, but with actions. In Clarkson's words, if you wish to honor a good man, let all his good actions live in your memory, so that they may constantly awaken you to imitation. Thus you will show that you really respect his memory. This is, in the end, what thankfulness means. Not just appreciation, but also imitation. To join your own conspiracy of decency. The question I want to answer in this lecture is simple. What would such a conspiracy look like? What vision, what program could renew liberal democracy in our time? And is there something we can learn from the groups that pulled it off in the past? Let's start there and consider one renegade circle in particular, the Fabian Society. They were a band of British elites in the late 19th century who plotted one of the most audacious conspiracies in the history of politics. And here's the remarkable thing. It worked. In 1887, they unveiled their manifesto, grandly titled the True Radical Program. They called it True Radical because they wanted to out-radical the other radicals. And indeed, the manifesto read like a utopian wish list. An 8-hour workday, votes for women, salaries for members of parliament, progressive taxation, public education, free school lunches, and even the nationalization of railroads. At the time, such ideas were seen as utterly fringe, the kind of plans only cranks would put on paper. And yet, one by one, every single demand became reality. Today, the True Radical Program doesn't read like a utopian wish list, but like a plain description of the modern welfare state. How did it happen? How did the impossible become inevitable? Well, the origins of this conspiracy were, fittingly, very conspiracy-like. It didn't begin in a parliament or a university, but in a haunted house. In the 1880s, spiritualism was all the rage among London's elites. Seances, table tapping, ghost hunting, it was the pseudoscience of the day. And two young men, Edward Peace and Frank Potmore, shared an enthusiasm for it. One night, they obtained the key to an old house in Notting Hill, left the door unlocked, and returned at midnight, hoping to glimpse something abnormal. The ghosts, alas, sorely disappointed them that night. But while they sat in the dark, waiting for rattling chains, their conversation turned to something more radical: the possibility of social reform. So from this half-serious ghost hunt emerged something more serious. Potmore, Pease, and a few others founded a society called the Fellowship of the New Life. Their conviction was that social transformation had to begin with personal transformation. Because if you could change yourself, then changing the world would be easy peasy. The members pledged to live by higher virtues. They advocated pacifism, vegetarianism, simple living, and intellectual honesty. Their objective was the reconstruction of society in accordance with the highest moral possibilities. By living lives of clarity and restraint, the New Lifers hoped to set an example that others would follow, which would, in time, transform society itself. Still, as the meetings continued, a division began to appear. For some, the fellowship was primarily a moral project. For others, it was also a political project. And as the months went by, the debates about wages and taxation gradually began to crowd out the discussions of pacifism and simple living. Until, on the 4th of January 1884, the politically minded members of the fellowship split off, forming their own society. It was ghost hunter Frank Potmore who proposed the name for this new club, the Fabian Society. He chose that name for quite conspiratorial reasons. Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus, the Roman general, had worn down Hannibal's army not through pitched battles, but through patience and persistence. His nickname was the Delayer. And that was the spirit Potmore wanted to capture. Socialism, he believed, would not conquer Britain by storming the gates of capitalism, but by slipping quietly through the back door. Unlike the communists, the Fabians didn't believe in a single violent revolution to usher in utopia. Their chosen emblem was the tortoise, an image of slow, steady advance. Their coat of arms depicted a wolf in sheep's clothing. For rather obvious PR reasons, that particular symbol was later abandoned. But from the outset, the mix of patience and subversion gave the Fabians an air of intrigue. And it wasn't long before the brightest young minds of Britain wanted to be a part of it. The Fabian Society became a magnet for the most talented and, for lack of a better word, coolest people in Britain. Its members included luminaries such as H.G. Wells, Emmeline Pankhurst, and Bertrand Russell. Most who joined were fresh university graduates who loved to debate. Talk was their medium, and through talk their ideas took shape. When a lecture went down particularly well, it was turned into a pamphlet or a lecture tour, which in turn could spark a lot of media attention. The most influential of these tracts came from the so-called 7 Fabian essayists, among them the playwright George Bernard Shaw, who was also the author of that True Radical program. Just 7 years after its founding, the Society had already distributed some 100,000 pamphlets, an astonishing number for the time. One of the reasons the Fabians were so fashionable was that they were masters of marketing. They didn't churn out long tracts on long-dead German philosophers, but they wrote in plain language, accessible to anyone in the street. At the same time, they catered to the aesthetic tastes of the elite. Most revolutionary pamphlets of the day were sloppily designed and printed on cheap, ugly paper, which gave them a disreputable air, dirty, amateurish, not to be taken seriously. The Fabians, by contrast, took pride in producing material that looked polished and elegant. Sleek invitation cards printed on blood-red paper, conferences that ran with flawless precision. As George Bernard Shaw recalled, "We used to be plentifully sneered at as fops and armchair socialists for our attention to these details. But I think it was by no means the least of our merits." In this way, the Fabian Society became a nursery of political talent. For young, ambitious idealists, joining the Fabians was the coolest move you could make. It was the place to be, host to the sharpest debates, the most glamorous gatherings, and the best parties. And bit by bit, Fabian members began to take seats on school boards and local councils. This was the beginning of a long march through the institutions, because the Fabians knew that the minor bureaucrats of today could become the major power brokers of tomorrow. They left an impressive legacy. The Fabians founded the London School of Economics and played a central role in the creation of the Labour Party. For the next half-century, Fabianism set the tone, and the once unthinkable became reality. Public education, universal healthcare, an 8-hour workday, votes for women, and progressive taxation with marginal rates for the rich climbing as high as 90% in the 1950s and 60s. After failing to summon the dead, the ghost hunters of Notting Hill ended up conjuring something much more powerful: the spirit of modern social democracy. Today, much of the Fabian legacy is under siege. As we all know, taxes for the rich have plummeted, social services are strained, and democracy is faltering. Ironically, the decline of the Fabian project was also the result of a conspiracy. On April 10, 1947, a small group of intellectuals gathered in the Swiss village of Montpellier. They called themselves neoliberals. Among them were the philosopher Friedrich Hayek and the economist Milton Friedman. They feared that the growing power of the state would usher in a new kind of tyranny. And so they rebelled. Like the Fabians, the neoliberals knew that effective resistance would take time. Hayek wrote that the interval between the change in opinion and the corresponding change in policy is usually a generation or even more. And Friedman agreed. He said, "The people now running the country reflect the intellectual atmosphere of some 2 decades ago when they were in college." The neoliberals believed in the primacy of self-interest. Whatever the problem, their answer was the same: roll back the state, unleash business. The government should turn every sector into a marketplace, from healthcare to education. The neoliberals knew they were far outside the mainstream, but that only spurred them on. By 1969, Time magazine described Friedman as a Paris designer whose haute couture is bought by a select few, but who nonetheless influences almost all popular fashions. Crises were central to Friedman's thinking. In the preface of his masterpiece, Capitalism and Freedom from 1982, he wrote words that became a neoliberal mantra. It's worth quoting them in full. "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function: to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable." Strikingly, this neoliberal strategy echoed the Fabian approach from a century earlier. On the title page of the very first Fabian pamphlet, we read, "For the right moment you must wait, as Fabius did most patiently when warring against Hannibal. but when the time comes, you must strike hard. And that's exactly what happened. When the crises of the 1970s hit, stagflation, the oil shock, massive strikes, the neoliberals did strike hard. They had spent decades building a network of think tanks, journals, and foundations, ensuring their ideas would be the ones lying around. In the subsequent years, a new common sense was born. The government was the problem. Markets were the solution. Progress meant deregulating, privatizing, cutting, globalizing. Step by step, state-owned companies were sold, unions weakened, and social benefits cut. Conservative leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher adopted Hayek and Friedman's once radical doctrines. Soon, their political adversaries followed suit. Bill Clinton declared the era of big government is over, while Tony Blair's New Labour embraced market reforms once associated with the right. And for a while, neoliberalism seemed to work. Inflation was tamed, growth returned, and stock markets soared. But as the decades passed, the price became clear. Hollowed out communities, spiraling inequality, financial crises, and ecological destruction. Today, the ideology that reigned from the 1980s until the pandemic no longer inspires. It is intellectually exhausted, morally bankrupt, and politically toxic. Yet its ghost still lingers, haunting our institutions, constraining our imaginations. When I, as a 25-year-old, wrote my first book, Utopia for Realists, I wanted to banish this ghost. I was simply bored with neoliberal politics. The debates felt so narrow and technocratic. Where was the bigger vision? Where were the bold ideas that once transformed societies? The book was my attempt to reclaim utopia as a political compass, to show what once seemed radical, like women's suffrage or weekends, had become common sense, and that we could do the same again, build a society of trust and abundance. Now, in the decades since, I've received about half of what I wished for. Politics is certainly not boring anymore. The old consensus is shattered. Across the world, people are hungry for change, for grand narratives, for a sense of direction. But instead of a renaissance of hope, we've seen a resurgence of fear. Instead of solidarity, we've witnessed the rise of resentment. Neoliberalism is dead, and it has been replaced by demagogues who promise greatness while peddling hatred and division. And so the question I once posed with optimism now returns with greater urgency. Can we once again reclaim utopia? Not as a naive fantasy, but as a guiding star for renewal. Because the crisis has arrived, the iron of history is hot, and now everything depends on the ideas lying around. Fabianism and neoliberalism had coherence, conviction, and strategy. They had a story about what went wrong and a vision of what to do next. They had institutions willing to play the long game, and they built a counter-elite that reshaped the world. Where is the progressive equivalent today? What comes after neoliberalism? Who are the neo-Fabians? What would today's true radical program look like? And who is organizing the next conspiracy of decency? Let's start with the good news. The foundations for a new social contract are already being laid. We are in the midst of a quiet renaissance in economic and social thought. In the first place, we've relearned something the Fabians already knew. The government doesn't just cut checks, it can take the biggest, boldest risks. Without public investment, we wouldn't have the internet, GPS, or even the touchscreen on our phone. The same goes for the mRNA vaccines that saved millions of lives during COVID. Again and again, it's been taxpayers, not billionaires, who made the breakthrough bets. Now, imagine a state that embraces this rule fully, where the brightest minds don't waste their talent polishing PowerPoints at McKinsey, but build high-speed rail or cure entire classes of disease. Imagine the massive profits from AI, technology rooted in decades of government-funded research, flowing into a national wealth fund that paid every citizen a monthly dividend. I'm not talking about a lumbering, red tape-ridden government here. On the contrary, deregulation still matters if we want to make abundance real. Not in the old, neoliberal sense of slashing rules to goose shareholders' profits, but in a new sense of clearing away the bottlenecks that keep us from building the things people need. Too many of our problems today are created by rules of our own making. Zoning codes that ban new housing, permits that trap wind farms in years of paperwork, procedures that reward stalling instead of doing. These aren't minor inconveniences. They're why rents are sky high, why commutes are miserable, and why clean energy isn't rolling out fast enough. It's scarcity by design, and it fuels the resentment that dominates our politics. Of course, lifting these artificial barriers is only half the battle. Building a society of abundance also takes resources on a scale we have not dared to imagine in decades. And people ask, quite reasonably, how will we pay for all this? It begins with a tax system that is fair, simple, and built on the principle that work and wealth should play by the same rules. For too long, the rules have favored money made from money over money made from work. And that's why billionaires pay lower effective tax rates than their own employees. A new school of economists, people like Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Zucman, have shown that it doesn't have to be this way. Imagine a world where banks automatically share account information so fortunes can't quietly disappear into Swiss vaults or Caribbean shell companies. Where global corporations no longer shift profits to Ireland or Bermuda, but pay a minimum tax rate wherever they operate. Where a billionaire with a $200 million yacht contributes on the same straightforward terms as a nurse or a teacher. For decades we were told that this could not be done. That the rich would always slip through the cracks, hiding their money in offshore accounts and fancy trusts. But now, we have the tools, the spreadsheets, and a step-by-step plan to make tax fairness a reality. And when everyone pays in, society can pay out. Imagine every parent having affordable childcare. Imagine schools where teaching is one of the most respected and best paid professions. Imagine colleges that launch young people into opportunity instead of debt. Imagine healthcare that is accessible to all, not just to cure illness, but to keep us healthy in the first place. Of course, this would be just the basics. We can and should go further and be as utopian as the Fabians were. We could build countries people dream of living in, where everyday life feels lavish in the best sense. Where the bounty of technological progress is shared by all, not hoarded by a few. Where leisure, beauty, and security are everyone's birthrights. Neoliberalism taught us that such things are too expensive. But in many cases, what looks expensive is actually efficient. Solving poverty or homelessness costs far less than managing and policing it. And here's something many people don't realize. It's actually normal for costs in areas like healthcare, education, and the arts to rise faster than the price of things like phones or fridges. The economist William Baumol already observed in the 1960s that prices in labor-intensive sectors rise faster than in sectors where work can be easily automated. A fridge can be produced ever more cheaply, but an hour of real human attention cannot. Economists gave this trend a name: Baumol's cost disease. But here's the irony. William Baumol himself never saw this as a problem. He saw it as a blessing. The more efficient our machines and computers become, the more time we can free up for what truly matters: caring for the vulnerable, educating our children, and making beautiful art. The real obstacle to having these things, Baumol warned, is the illusion that we cannot afford them. The basics of a good life are not luxuries we must trade off against growth. They are the dividends of growth. Neoliberalism said we had to choose, but we don't. We can have prosperity and fairness, efficiency and dignity. We can have our cake and eat it. In short, I believe the contours of our true radical program are beginning to take shape. But like the Fabians and the neoliberals, we should remember that dreams and desires, plans and programs are not enough. Ideas only matter if they are organized, institutionalized, and carried through the storms of history. That means more than a few good speeches. It means building durable networks of people and institutions, deep-pocketed donors who are willing to think in decades rather than election cycles, policy shops that can translate ideals into legislation, movements that can win over diverse constituencies, and cultural platforms that can shape public opinion from the courthouse to the classroom, from the op-ed page to the dinner table. Above all, it requires perseverance. History shows what small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens can achieve if they play the long game. Of the 12 founders of the British Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, only one lived long enough to see slavery abolished across the British Empire. Of the 68 women who gathered at Seneca Falls in 1848 for the first Women's Rights Convention in the United States, only one was still alive when women finally won the vote. And she was too ill to go to the polls that day. Our job is not to conjure utopia overnight, but to fight with the patience of General Fabius, to follow in the footsteps of the moral pioneers who came before us, to be thankful, not with nostalgia, but with imitation. Thank you.